Hello and welcome to part 1 of 4 of me trying to build my first ever table. In this video, I learn how hard it is to move heavy things by yourself, install some beefy bow ties, and also have an abnormally easy encounter with epoxy. Completely oblivious to the difficulties that lie ahead, my journey begins. This project was far larger and even more complex than anything I had ever taken on before. A family friend of mine approached me one day and asked if I would be up for building him a table for his new work office. I responded rather indecisively, but agreed to consider it. 2 days later, I found myself riding with him an hour away to look at some slabs he had found on Facebook Marketplace. After seeing the slabs and talking to him about the project for 2 hours straight in the car that day, there was no way I could pass up on this opportunity. My lack of confidence in my own ability was only surpassed by his seemingly supreme confidence in my ability, which still puzzles me to this day. The only things he has seen that I have made are a handful of pens and a box or two, but somehow he had decided that I was the man for the job. One table quickly turned into 3, and I ended up driving back out a week later to purchase the slabs. When I arrived back at the garage with the slabs, I kind of woke up and realized that I was by myself, and moving these massive slabs would be no easy task. Unfortunately, the viewer's attention span is far too short for me to portray just how much of a challenge it was to unload these things. But trust me, it was far more difficult than people on YouTube make it look. Which is a good summary to this whole project, really. I think if there's one thing I learned from this entire build, it is that doing things in real life is far more difficult than they look on the internet. Seeing as I have never made anything quite like this before, my shop was totally unprepared to accommodate 3 big slabs. So I had to make do and use an old bed frame to hold the table as I began the incredibly tedious task that was cleaning up the whole slab. There was bark that needed to be removed and tons of dirt, dust, and rotted wood that needed to be scraped and chiseled out of the center. I was told this wood was cypress, which is quite believable because the wood is very easily dented and scratched, a factor which will certainly impact the decision on what finish to use, but that decision doesn't have to be made for a long time. As I was cleaning out the crack in the center, I realized I was going to need to use some bow ties to hold this thing together. It was borderline snapping in half, and pouring epoxy in the center would help fix this problem, but I needed a somewhat temporary solution until I was ready for epoxy. Plus, the extra strength of the bow ties will certainly be beneficial in the long term for this table. I traced out some large bow ties onto a piece of oak using a template, and then proceeded to cut them down first with my miter saw, the blade of which is still incredibly dull, and then I cut them down the rest of the way with my scroll saw. A slightly more optimal and appropriate tool to use would have been a bandsaw, but I don't exactly have one of those. Yet. One issue with putting bow ties into this table was that the customer mentioned prior had expressed his distaste for how bow ties looked. I explained to him that sometimes bow ties served a practical and functional purpose, but that did not change his stance on the appearance of them. To deal with this very minor conflict, I decided to put the bow ties into the bottom of the table rather than the top. One of the things I really enjoy about the process of putting bow ties into place is taking time on the layout. The layout here was going to be on the bottom of the table, so as far as appearance was concerned, it mattered very little. And yet, I took my time, making sure that they were lined up to be most supportive to hold the cracked wood in place. The shape of the bow tie is key to its function. As you move from the inside outward, the shape becomes wider, making it nearly impossible for the crack it is holding in place to get any wider than it already is. As some of you may have already noticed, my method of cutting out the recess for bow ties is rather abnormal. Typically, one would use a router equipped with a straight bit and plunge it into the wood and cut it out that way. I have used that method for smaller bow ties, but because the bow ties I am using here were so very large, I decided to start by hogging out the majority of the material with a Forstner bit in my drill. After that was done, I could use a chisel to get the right shape. This took a good deal of time and wasn't perfectly precise, but luckily it was on the bottom of the table, so a very, very slight gap would matter not. One technique that I have adapted and come to enjoy very much is to take the time to write a note inside a bow tie or inlay recess to the recipient of the piece, knowing full well that they will never get to see it, due to the fact that it is trapped behind a solid piece of wood. It brings me a strange pleasure to know that something that is seen and used every day has a little secret message somewhere inside it that only I know the content of. As soon as the message is written, I immediately apply a very liberal amount of glue inside the recess and put the bow tie into place. This one was a bit loose, so I added some extra tabs on the sides to really clench them in tight. I then repeated this process for 3 more bow ties, with increasingly better precision, which led to more and more use of my mallet to get them into place. Once the pieces were securely glued in place, I could come back and flush them up with a hand planer and then my sander. This wasn't entirely necessary because in the next video I figure out a method of flattening this big thing without having a planer the size of grease or a CNC as expensive as grease, but I wanted to do it anyway just to kind of finalize the bow tie process. With the bow ties done, I could return to slab cleanup. I got these nylon wheel drill attachments that remove all the debris from the live edge of the wood, without damaging the unique and intricate shape of the edge of the wood itself. I learned about these little wheels from Cam from Blacktail Studio. He was sort of my secret savior during this entire build. He doesn't even know I exist, but without his helpful and entertaining videos, I can confidently say that I would have failed at making this table. I picked up so many key techniques and procedures from his videos, as well as just little tips and tricks that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. Not only that, but he is also the pinnacle of entertainment and interesting woodworking content. I don't know how anyone watching my tiny channel wouldn't already know about his channel, but if this is your first time hearing about him, go check him out. He also has a whole course on building epoxy tables, but like the genius that I am, I did not buy it. This corner of the slab was rotted and punky. Similar to my relationships, it was very dry and had potential to crumble completely at any moment. The best way I knew how to fix this was to use some penetrating epoxy. As I understand it, penetrating epoxy is a very liquidy epoxy that has an extremely long cure time, meaning that even after you mix it up, it stays in liquid form for an abnormal amount of time. This gives it time to seep into punky wood like this before hardening to stabilize the wood. Pot life? What the heck is pot life? Is that what hippies are into these days? Is that like beach life but pot life? Another little trick I learned from Blacktail Studio is that saying controversial and mildly offensive things in your videos is a great way to get a lot of comments and dislikes on your videos, which tells YouTube that a lot of people are engaging with your content and they are likely to recommend it to even more people, resulting in even more views. I have no idea if anyone would actually be offended if I said hippies were into pot life, but everyone has to start somewhere. It's an awkward line because my parents and grandparents and cousins and all sorts will occasionally watch my videos, so I have to find the sweet spot of stirring up and offending the general public without stirring up and offending the people I actually care about, which is an incredibly difficult task. I mixed up the epoxy for probably 5 or 7 minutes and then took it over to the slab and applied it with a brush. I brushed it on, let it seep in, and then brushed it on some more. I probably repeated this 4 or 7 times over the course of an hour until the wood was completely saturated. Now you might be like, Trotters, this video only has 30 seconds left. There's no way you can turn this mess into a table in 30 seconds. And you would be right. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a 4-part series broken up into about 10-minute sections, mainly because the thought of editing and voicing over a 40-minute long video just seems completely overwhelming. So, if you are watching this before March 9th, 2023, subscribe to see the next video next week. If this is after March 9th, 2023, the next video will be in the top right corner. As always, thanks for watching. Feel free to comment down below, and if you feel I deserve it, please subscribe. Until next time, go find some treasure.